Hi everyone, you're listening into What's Going On, a podcast series where we have important, relevant, and sometimes difficult conversations to inspire you to start having your own. In today's episode, we're talking about the intersectionality of queerness, Islam, and politics. As we talk about the trials, tribulations, and celebrations of being queer and Muslim, we should also remember the eradication of culture and identity that Indigenous people face in America. What's Going On is by Suffolk University's Center for Student Diversity and Inclusion in Boston, Massachusetts. Hence, we would like to honor the Mashpee Wampanoag, Akina Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and the Massachusetts tribal nations whom this land originally belonged. It is imperative to acknowledge the Massachusetts tribe, who historically lived in areas that make up present-day Greater Boston. We honor the diverse tribes, people, and respect their connection to this land. To know more about the land you are on and ways you can support the Indigenous community, please visit www.native-land.ca. And for those of us in Massachusetts, maindigenousagenda.org. You can also find out more about the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous people at mmihwhoismissing.org. Now, let us jump right into the episode with Jordan Ahmed, and the community organizer and artist with the Muslim Justice League. Hi, Jordan.
Hi, Xin Yi.
How's it going?
I am doing so well, and I'm so excited to be here.
And at the time of this recording, it's your birthday, so happy birthday.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm entering a new decade. I am now officially in my 30s. I spent the last year of my 20s in a pandemic. So, grateful to be here. I feel like this is a great way to celebrate my birthday, talking about things I really care about.
So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, so my name is Jordan Ahmed. I use they, them pronouns. I am currently the community organizer at Muslim Justice League here in Boston. I'm also an artist, an educator. I've worked as a performance artist. I've worked in Cambridge public schools. I consider myself, I have a pretty eclectic background, and I really have learned to like cherish and celebrate that. So I bring all of these other roles I've had in the past, whether it's as a counselor through social work or a teacher or a dancer, into my role now as a community organizer. Yeah.
Nice. I love it when someone comes into the space with varied life experiences, including their careers, because it also shows to the students and audiences listening. This is like a period of job search for a lot of people, right?
Mhm,
And
mhm.
hearing that you have transferred your skills through different careers, hopefully will bring people hope.
Yeah.
But we are here today to talk about essentially what is it like being queer and being Muslim in the United States. And so let's start off with talking about what is Islam? Can you give us an overview for folks like myself who don't practice the religion, kind of like a picture of what is it like to be a Muslim?
Yeah, absolutely. And I approach this question not really as an Orthodox Muslim. I grew up in the United States. My family immigrated from Bangladesh, Pakistan on one side of my family, on the other side of my family from Indonesia, and then also like my grandfather is like a white American guy in Ohio. I grew up in Ohio. So my relationship to Islam and how I view Islam is definitely not going to be the same as necessarily anybody else. I think in a lot of ways we we think of religious communities and like Muslims or Christians or Buddhists as a monolith, like each is a monolith and experiences the world in this way that we imagine must be the case for all Muslims. So I can tell you what Islam is to me, knowing that even my definition and understanding of Islam is constantly evolving and changing. I, have had a very like varied relationship with Islam. It's changed over the years. So for me right now, Islam is a window into family, into community, into an understanding of how I was raised to be a like moral, good person who thinks of charity and compassion. I think of Islam also as being very rooted in justice. I think it's very connected to the work I do now that's related to racial, social justice. And I also think that there's a real difference between the like religion and like the Quran and Ramadan and like the practice of being Muslim and various Muslim communities around the world and things that I think a lot of people might assume is like, written in the Quran that is actually just like various cultural practices that kind of are meshed in and like tied together with Islam. But yeah, I mean, I'm someone who I don't pray 5 times a day. And when I do pray, it's a combination practice for me of other spiritual practices I've developed over the years. So I know this is a very wide ranging answer, but I think yeah, I would come back to the root of it is that for me, Islam means one foundation in family and community. Two, for me, a real deep faith and trust in, whether we call it Allah or God or the beloved or the universe, whatever this creative being or this creative force in the world is, like having a deep trust in that and feeling like I am part of that, you are part of that, everyone around me is part of that. And our well being is all tied together.
You make a very important point that your experience with Islam is very personal and it's your definition, it's your experience. I think it makes a point of that no communities are a single monolith. People who, like you mentioned, practice Islam have different ways of practicing it. And I also learned really quickly from your definition about how you learn and live those timeless values, right? About family. Like Islam to you is about family and respect and learning all those. How do we practice those in our day-to-day lives? And I hope that audiences can draw that bridge and draw that connection between the fact that a lot of people when they practice religion, we practice it to live our lives in better ways that serves ourselves and also serve the community, right? And I think it's important and critical to draw that bridge as we've done just now, and also we did a previous episode on Christocentricity and religion, and so um, yeah. And moving forward, when you talk about how you're still exploring yourself in terms of like your relationship with Islam and also with queerness, um, will you talk to us a little bit about the intersection between religion and gender identity, sexual orientation?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, when you're talking about like what we were just saying and what you were reflecting on and what I shared, thinking about how no religious community is a monolith, I think it's almost for me, I live with so many like multi-variable identities that I'm just so used to like I myself feel like there's just no monolithic community. One, there isn't really any monolithic community, but two, even if there were, there's none that match exactly who I am because so for audiences, so I am Muslim, I am queer, I am non-binary slash genderqueer. I'm also multiracial with a combination, as I said, of like South Asian heritage. My grandmother immigrated from Indonesia. My grandfather is a white man in Ohio who I love very dearly and I'm very close to. So, I have this whole scope of identity um, that I've really grown to find connections between. I used to compartmentalize myself. Like it was very much like so specifically in talking about Islam and queerness, I grew up feeling like those two things did not intersect and, in fact, were mutually exclusive. So I could either be a good Muslim or I could experience queerness. Like I couldn't do both at the same time. And I felt like, were I to come out to my family, I would lose my family, I would lose my faith. Um, Spoiler alert, that didn't happen. I'm actually like incredibly connected to my family. I think that the person who's been hardest on me in coming out in the various ways I've come out and I'm still coming out, I have been the hardest on myself. And I think in some ways I was holding myself back from living my life in my full truth. I mean, I think the best example to I think frame being queer and being Muslim and growing up in the United States was, so 9/11 happened when I was in, I think it was fourth or fifth grade. So I'm, like somewhere, I think it was like 10 or 11. Um, so this is at the same time I'm like starting to understand and like hear about sexuality. We're having like, the talk at school. My dad is trying to have the talk with me. Meanwhile, my parents are divorcing, and I'm living with my father and my very Muslim grandmother, who I call Amma. Um, so 9/11 happens, this like huge event that defines and continues to define being Muslim in the United States happens as I'm just now able to really understand the news, as I am seeing people talk about Muslims every day, as I'm also having thoughts of like, at the time, I mean, I didn't really have words for it, but what I would later grow to define at the time as gay and later as queer. Um, so not only was I then subject to both external and internal Islamophobia, where I basically went into hiding about my faith. So I didn't tell kids at school that I was Muslim for fear of being othered, for fear of being called a terrorist. And even I would tell some of my friends, but even then I would get books from students at school trying to convert me to Christianity, thinking that they needed to save me. And at the same time, I am feeling immense guilt for what I'm now understanding as like budding queerness. Um, and I shut that part of myself down, So for me, my early experiences of being queer and Muslim were defined by hiding. Um, they were defined by hiding not only from my family or my peers, but also from myself. So these two pieces basically remained a secret until I went until the summer before I went to college. I went through this huge explosion, and I sent this dramatic email to my parents saying, I'm bisexual and I'm leaving Islam because now I'm 18 and the sin isn't on you if there is a sin. And like, I'm going off to college and I'm going to live my life and figure myself out. So, one, I like didn't end up identifying as bisexual, and I have sort of reclaimed my faith. And that relationship to Islam is something, and to queerness is something that I feel like I've only really found the words to reconcile really in the aftermath of Trump's election in 2016, and feeling like seeing my communities being attacked and wanting to own and protect and stand up for all of them.
I thank you for firstly really generously sharing your journey. I think it's something very deeply personal, and I hope that your story is able to relate to the younger generation who are Muslim and perhaps exploring their themselves, whether it's their sexuality or gender identity. And also for non-Muslims like myself, I think so I am heterosexual and cisgender, and I'm immensely grateful to be able to hear this story from you, because it helps me learn about the trials and tribulation, and also remind me of what privilege really means.
Mm.
I can hear and perhaps even feel a little bit of those emotions that come from your sharing, but I will never be able to experience those
Yeah.
experiences.
And
And
I really appreciate you saying that. And something that I think about when I think about something like privilege is the ways that I also carry a lot of privilege. Like on the surface, I would appear like if you're reading my bio, for example, I would appear to be like, you know, super oppressed or marginalized or however you want to define it. But in my life, like I've also lived with a lot of privilege. Have always had food on the table. I have always had a loving family. I'm someone who has been able to come out and be supported and loved, which is not a universal experience. And not
Mhm.
just for Muslims, but for people generally. It doesn't matter what
Right.
family you're coming out to and what faith background or no faith background. I feel like coming out can be really dangerous for a lot of people. And I've been so fortunate that, I've made a lot of mistakes in my coming out journey and isolating people who didn't need to be isolated. And I am so grateful that all of those people, including people as close to me as my father, are still in my life and that we're so close. And, like, especially when you think about privilege, like just like multivariate. So you're thinking like, though I am non-binary, I've lived in the world most of my life as a man, and I'm regularly perceived as such. And that comes with a lot of privilege. Of course, there's also then, the challenge of like people perceive me as something I'm not, and that can be a struggle in itself. But, when you're talking about trials and tribulations, I think it's like the trials, tribulation, and celebration. So there's also like this big piece of my life where, so just to ground it in a story, a really short one. So my stepmother was who I'm really close to. I call her Monomer. So Monomer and I are we're very close. We used to joke that like she didn't understand superheroes, so we're the Justice of the League rather than the Justice League. And my dad and my brothers are the Legion of Doom, which is just really funny. But so my stepmom and I are really close. And when I came out, this was for the second time. So I came out as bi, then I came out as gay, and then I just gradually shifted from understanding myself and expressing myself as gay to queer. But when I came out as gay, this was in college. At first, Monomer was like, said, I love you and I believe you and support you, but, my faith tells me that like I can't necessarily reconcile and like I'm going to be here for you, but I don't fully understand. Fast forward to like maybe as soon as like 9 months later, my stepmother took me to my first gay bar. Um, like, so that is like, I think there's just such a potential for people to expand their understanding once they really get to know and understand where you're coming from and see that this isn't just a phase, like my identity isn't a phase. This is like, I kissed a boy on the cheek in first grade and like, he threatened to tattle on me. So then I was like, okay, this is bad. I'm going to hide this. But like, yeah, I really bristle when people talk about this as like a choice. But I also bristle when people, I have a very, this is like speaking of privilege, I have a very privileged life in the sense that my family is so supportive. But I do sometimes feel like some people just need a little bit of time to really reconcile things and understand, and I wish I could have heard this from somebody like me when I was younger. I think it could have saved me from a lot of pain. And I hope that by being open and honest in an interview like this, that maybe even if one person hears this and is like, oh, it's okay for me to be myself, that, means the world to me. But it also is a constant struggle. Like today is my 30th birthday. I don't know. I hesitate to say this because it puts it in words and then I, feel like I have a contract to hold myself to. But like tonight, I'm hoping to, so I'm in a pod with my family who recently returned from Singapore after a long stay there. Um, I'm hoping to have the conversation about gender with them tonight on my 30th birthday. And this is, like, I've gone through so much to have my family understand queerness and understand how I've reconciled my relationship to Islam. But the process of coming out is never ending in many ways. And like identity is constantly in flux. And for me, I want my family to know how I see myself and who I am. And I made the mistake of keeping them at arm's length in my process of coming out as queer. And I don't want to do so as I like come to terms with my gender. So, stay tuned.
Yeah, I'll be looking forward to an update from you about that. I'm from Singapore, and um, I guess that's how I kind of, in that way, have first-hand experience about how Islam and Muslims are not a monolith. Back to like what we mentioned earlier, having met so many different Muslims and how different everyone practice the religion, and I think it's also a lesson worth learning when you mention about sometimes people just need time.
Mhm.
I think in today's times when in that sense everything is in the air, right? We talk about nowadays we talk about race, talk about equity, and that often means dismantling things and reforming things. And we get into this, I myself get into this very often binary, ironically, of how um if it's either you're for the movement or you're against the movement.
Mhm.
And some people had made a decision simply based on misinformation or a lack of information, which are two different things, but arrive at the same outcome. And so
Yeah.
I think it's a great reminder from you for um, people like myself and people who are listening in who are most probably keen or at least curious about social justice work. They will always remember that compassion is a key ingredient, right? That yes, sometimes we have to draw borders with people who are decidedly closed off to the concepts of social justice and equity for all. But there are also a lot of people who are on the fence, and there are also a lot of people who are willing to listen and have a conversation.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that's part of intersectionality, right? When you mention that beyond trials and tribulations, there's also celebration. That with despite all the differences, or rather more specifically oppression that comes with the current system, there are also ways to celebrate, and there are also ways to remember and in a way thrive in our lives. And that kind of really ties into the whole concept of intersectionality in terms of understanding that we all have different identities that makes it easier for us to traverse society. There are our identities that we identify with that makes it harder for us. And it's really about navigating and speaking to more people who identify as close to us as possible. And so I hope that people who are listening in who feels alone and lonely, um, who share similar identities as you, can hear your experience and find hope and find that there are probably ways to celebrate themselves.
Yeah.
And I think that's the ultimate goal for the both of us, right?
Yeah. I mean, you're touching on a lot of things that I want to echo and elaborate on. One being that yes, there is so much nuance in these conversations, and I think that more people are willing to have them than sometimes we give credit to. But I will also advocate within that sometimes boundaries are necessary and healthy. Like if I've learned anything in more than a decade of therapy, it's that boundaries are essential. Um, and yeah, sometimes you do need to put up a boundary, and that's okay, and that's healthy, and that happens with people who are closest to us. Um, but I will say that with that being said, for better or worse, I believe in entering these conversations and leading with compassion and warmth and vulnerability. I think that if we're not willing to see the best in people and hope for the best in people and just want to extend kindness to everyone, whether or not they're going to agree with you. I think that, is sometimes an underestimated part when people from the outside look into like organizing work, for example. I think, what they think of is, I'll even get the stereotypes from my family will say, like, oh, where's your protest sign? Like, and like, yeah, that's a huge part of it. Direct action, creative direct actions are an essential part of organizing. But what that doesn't show you are the conversations once you get in the room with people with power. And the the easiest way to go about that is to be compassionate and remember that everyone you're talking to is a human being. Yeah, obviously, if I don't do this, but if I were organizing against a like multi-billionaire who didn't believe in my human rights, I would probably have a different tone. I would still lead with a smile, but yeah, I'm not advocating for like toxic positivity, let's be kind to everyone, even people who are harmful. Like, absolutely not. But in general, people who are just trying to do their best, and you can tell, and like maybe their best ends up in something that's really harmful for you or your community. Like I'm thinking about, so I'm currently on a leave of absence, but I was working on my MSW and MPH, so Master's in Social Work and Master's in Public Health degree at Boston University. And in January of 2020, so pre-pandemic, I was one of four students who were in the student union who was leading an anti-racism protest, and like we as the whole student union like developed and organized this protest that basically was like demands about curriculum and pay and equity and racial justice in very practical terms. And that protest led directly to a conversation with the dean and assistant dean and other folks in the school at the School of Social Work. And I've developed really close alliances with some of those people in those positions of power that I hope has and will continue to lead to a more equitable school. It's so wild because so I basically was protesting against the dean of the school, who I now consider a friend, who served as my recommendation to enter the role that I'm in now at Muslim Justice League. So, I think that those alliances and that progress was achieved through warmth and compassion and a desire for us to understand each other.
Really good support, like in terms of experience to your point. And you're talking about Muslim Justice League. Shift gears a little bit, and so tell us a little bit about what you do with MJL and about countering violent extremism.
Yeah, I would love to talk about this. So, I entered this role at Muslim Justice League in November. So I've been at it for a few months now. And Muslim Justice League, our vision is basically to identify and counter the national security surveillance state in the ways that it unjustly targets Muslims, Black folks, brown folks, people who are deemed politically like other or dangerous, and in other ways, like even ways that like queer trans communities are policed and surveilled. So that's the core of our work. And not only that, but on the flip side, it's not just what we're countering, it's also what we're building. So we are also an organization that believes in building up Muslim political power and building up our communities and you know helping connect them to the tools where they can sort of lean into their political power and their worth. I think that underneath a lot of organizing work generally and just social justice work is a desire for folks who are oppressed to demonstrate that their lives have value. I mean, that's at the core of something like the Black Lives Matter movement in some ways. It's just, what is so hard about people understanding that other people have value, and that people deserve dignity and respect and justice. And, when a whole community is being discriminated against or stereotyped as terrorists, essentially. Like that's what it boils down to, is in the United States, and this isn't just post 9/11, this is even pre 9/11, there's been a tie between like Islam and terrorism. Um, Despite the fact that people of other religious backgrounds and faiths also commit acts of violence. Like there's no, so when we talk about a program like Countering Violent Extremism, which is a program that came up under the Obama administration that basically serves as soft policing. So it's a way for helping professionals, service professionals, and like faith leaders, community leaders to basically be paid in grants to then surveil our community. So surveil their own community in some instances. Um, and at MJL, our largest campaign, and this is one where we're a national leader, is the Stop CVE campaign. So, our goal is to show and demonstrate the ways that these surveillance and like countering violent extremism programs actually serve to diminish and or eliminate like political power of marginalized people who often do hold ideas that might be counter to the American imperialist state, like colonial state. Um, and, so when we think about it, as this history of surveillance and this history of policing, I think our work is really just figuring out and demonstrating basically how to lift us back up and to call out these structures that are really hard to pinpoint. Because when you're talking about something like countering violent extremism, it's weird to say stop countering violent extremism because we don't believe in violence. We're not advocating for violent extremism. We're just saying that the ways that they're trying to identify it are unjust. So if you look at surveys that are given to people who get CVE grants that basically are supposed to be the warning signs of someone prone to radicalization, they include things like struggles with mental health, has a beard, practices their faith, are things that, or like struggles in romantic relationships. Like these are just parts of being a human being, they aren't signs of violence. And what's so mind-boggling and frustrating is that with these grants that, surpass millions of dollars, if you look at the end of these surveys, there's a caveat that essentially says none of these are proven to be risk factors for violence. So then it's like, okay, so the foundation of this program is based on nothing, based on discrimination, racialization. Um, so that's where it gets really frustrating because, the very direct consequences can lead to deportation, incarceration, and often unjustly, often not even always unjustly. I think what's so hard is this is an issue that is supported by like CVE and CVE like iterations, like now it's TVTP, Targeted Violence and Prevention Program. Um, they're supported on both sides of the aisle. So it like CVE was introduced under the Obama administration. Biden is planning on expanding those grants as a response to the insurrection at the Capitol. And what we at MJL really advocate for understanding is that any expansion of the uses of words like domestic terrorism or violent extremism will never actually be used in a meaningful way against white supremacists or white nationalists. Like it will always be used against brown and black people and Muslims, because the institutions that are putting those grants, those tools into practice are often white supremacist institutions. You can't ask institutions in the United States that have a history of white supremacist violence to, oppose white supremacist violence. Like looking at the ways that law enforcement was tied in part to the insurrection. Like it's just, it goes really deep in this country. And we have a really troubling history of racial violence, oppression, genocide, thinking of like indigenous peoples, the enslavement of people in Africa. I just think that all of this is connected, and countering CVE is one small part in dismantling these systems of white supremacy that we just assume to be okay as a society. And the really sad thing is most people don't know anything about CVE or the surveillance of Muslim communities and the ways that it's like truly led to just an underlying feeling of paranoia that we do not belong, that we will be watched, whether it's at the airport, whether it's in our mosques, whether it's by other community members might be reporting on our behavior. And it's pervasive. It goes through anything, you know, whether it's healthcare, social work, mental health care, you know, like if you can't trust your counselor to talk honestly about yourself because you're worried that you're being surveilled, you're less likely to access mental health care. And if you're not accessing mental health care, what if you're having suicidal ideation? What if you are struggling to cope with your anxiety? You're not going to get the support you need. I also recommend for folks who want to get a really just a good sense of these issues, watching The Feeling of Being Watched. It's a documentary that you can find on Amazon Prime. Um, it's incredible. It's made by many friends of MJL. Um, it talks about surveillance in Chicago and in Illinois, and basically the history of the surveillance of Muslims, and before Muslims, the surveillance of other targeted communities.
That's a good point and a great resource. Any resource mentioned in this episode, especially and also with NJL's website, will be included in the description box. So, if you're interested, just click on those links below. With regards to what you say, I just want people to know the extent of it. You know, with surveillance, so we all know that there are cameras all around, right? And people think that they're only used for police investigations only when something happens or something is reported, and this is not true. And I want to also bring awareness to the extent of Islamophobia as well. Just a few days ago, I forgot which state, but I'll also link the article below in the description box of a Sikh man. I think his name is Satman Singh,
Mhm.
and he was murdered because people thought that he was Muslim for his beard. So when you mention about how people are given grants and all these ridiculous questions about how a person, how they assess if a person is violent or is a terrorist or not, it just doesn't make sense, and it has real life consequences. Like people are getting killed and murdered innocently for all these misconceptions that are based on nothing but, frankly, white supremacy. With regards to also surveillance with face recognition, there has been a lot of research coming out with how face recognition is biased. They're
Mhm.
biased towards black and brown folks, and it's just illogical. And the whole basis behind racism is also illogical, right? But it's just so ingrained into society that we are still fighting the repercussions of such biases today. And I just thought to bring that up because um, I think we just need tangibles. You know, we need to hear the consequences of such things because people always think that, oh, government policies are so big and far and untouchable and intangible that it can be difficult for people to really understand and comprehend how their policies cascade down to our daily lives, to your daily lives. And so, thank you for that clear um, explanation about countering violent extremism and surveillance. Um, I also find it ironic that a lot of Americans are against so-called being a safe surveillance state when we are actually already a nation of surveillance. I remember, so back in Singapore when COVID happened, we had tracking, contact tracing, partly through technology, you know, through phone. You can opt for, if you don't want your data to be used, opt for like this little trinket that you can carry around with you, that you have to carry around with you. It's enforceable by law, while Americans here are just like don't infringe on my rights, don't survey me. I know that you use this data of my geographical location for something else. And it's just like, don't you already know that the government is already surveilling you?
Yeah.
Um,
And that's actually a really good point, because sometimes I think that people tune out to the work we do because they assume that it doesn't impact them. Like that whatever is being used against brown and black folks, if I'm a white person, it's not going to affect me. And I think that's a real challenge we need to overcome as a country and as a world, is assuming that what's happening to someone else would never happen to you. Because the truth is, so here's an example of the pipeline. So the United States military will try some sort of surveillance tactic in whatever area they're occupying on the local communities. Then researchers will take what they've learned from the military to universities like Harvard and teach classes on how to use those policies in communities in our country, particularly brown and black communities, especially black communities. And then, those policies, if they get the desired effect on those populations, pieces of those will be used throughout the country, or might be adopted and used in various communities that you might not expect will be surveilled. That I think is something we need to think about. Is one, these policies aren't just impacting Americans. Like the United States imperialist colonial interest in the world impacts millions of people and murders millions of people. Essentially, that's what's happening. Um, and for us to then come back and teach classes about how to use these practices, it's just alarming. I mean, there was a whole thing blowing up on Twitter about a Harvard class that was essentially doing that, and this is within the past couple months. And what you were saying about like the ways that policies, like, they seem really intangible and seem really hard to counter as a civilian, as a citizen, as a person. And I think that's often the work of organizers, is to make the intangible tangible, in the same way that a therapist might break down a problem in your life into small manageable pieces. An organizer breaks down this large challenge into smaller pieces. And also, the organizer doesn't do it alone. The organizer does it in community with other organizers. The organizer does it in community with the community, talking through how do we break down these big problems. And that's where, I'm someone who used to believe that my future was to go from community organizing and like policy work into politics. And I've actually really had a deep change of heart in seeing that there's so much more potential for us to build people power than there is for us to transform it from the top down. Like the truth is, we do have the power, and the more we're able to wake people up to the issues that face our communities, and the more we're able to tie ourselves to each other, invest in each other, believe that your well-being and it like is tied to mine, like as humans, and not only just humans, like our well-being is also tied to the well-being of the earth and like the world and the climate. So if we don't start operating as if we all need to uplift each other and take care of each other, like it doesn't matter if we have a queer Muslim brown non-binary person in office, like obviously I do take a lot of heart in having more representation in politics recently. Like I'm thinking of like a non-binary Muslim like Maury Turner. But like that can only get us so far. Identity politics only gets us so far. If we could have someone representing so many marginalized identities in president of the United States, and if we're still bombing Syria, then we're still not thinking about our collective well-being. It doesn't matter how it's rebranded, how we rebrand the Democratic Party. It goes beyond the two parties. So much of the biggest progress we've made in this country have come from people-led movements pushing those in power. And I think that's where we need more of it. You see a lot of organizing right now against student loan debt. You see organizing in support of Black lives. You see organizing against like national security policies like CVE. It's all those pieces, but obviously if I could wish for one thing, it would be like a countrywide worker strike and just like really putting the pressure. But that's a harder to organize. But yeah, so I just wanted to touch back onto a couple of things you said, because I do think it's important to talk about how we make those intangible challenges tangible.
Yeah, a lot of things come to mind. I think it's a love-hate relationship for me. What you talk about people power is really the reason behind me coming to the States. A lot of people always ask me, Singapore is such a safe and stable country. Like, yes, it's a bubble, but you're safe there. Why come to a country where it's so chaotic and so messy and riots are going everywhere? Which is what a lot of foreigners perceive the States, that the people are unruly. And that's part of the reason why I came here, that I feel like I have a voice and I can exercise that voice, and that there are people who will be willing to organize around a common goal, and work towards that. And it's also contradictory because at the same time, my personal experience is that Americans are still very individualist.
Mhm.
You talk about collective well-being, right? I think part of the reason why it's so hard to kind of start instilling this mindset of abundance over scarcity is
Mhm.
that it's not merely about thinking for themselves that's individualistic, but it's more of like they don't see the connection between human beings,
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
it
And
makes sense.
like the basis of social justice work really should be, I will sound like a broken record, but it should be about intersectionality, that it shouldn't have to happen to someone for it to matter to that person. It shouldn't have to happen to me with surveillance and being untreated fairly for it to matter to me, for your safety and your community safety to matter to me, to for me to like activate and work against that. Your response also made me recall the poem by, I think, a Holocaust survivor about how he never spoke up when other people were harmed. And when it came time for him as a Jew, nobody came.
Yeah.
And so cycle is repeating itself in that way, looking at like so-called being meta and looking at the bigger picture. And so when will it stop? When does it come time for us to really think for one another and also for ourselves? And segueing into kind of wrapping up the session, I know you mentioned a little bit about it, but what is your vision for the future?
Hmm. Well, okay, so I have two pieces. One, I want to respond to what you just said, and then I'll talk about my vision for the future, because I think what you were saying about like American individualism, I think it's really important. It's important to address, and also a way for me to talk about queerness and Islam as being two places in my life and two spheres in my life where I have learned about collective interest, where, yeah, we grow up in a country where, like, I grew up in this country where rugged individualism is the like name of the game. It's like pull yourself up by your bootstraps. If you're depressed, feel better, work hard, you'll find a way through it. And that infiltrates everything. It's so deep how individualized our lives are in the United States, and it's so dangerous. Individualism is what has led to the huge wealth disparity in this country, because people will vote against their own interests, thinking that maybe one day they would be that rich person who doesn't want to be taxed. That limits us in so many ways, when instead, like, why can't we all live a life with dignity and the resources we need to just survive and eat and feed our family and our children? And what I love about, and this is where I think there are, like, I'm only realizing this in this conversation, and I'm sure I've realized it in ways before, but like I said at the beginning of this talk, like for me, Islam, first and foremost, means family and community. It means that for me, I grew up with my whole Muslim family believing that like my well-being mattered to them and their well-being mattered to me, and we needed to take care of each other. And I also had amazing role models like my stepmother and my grandmother, both of whom I mentioned in this chat, who, they have demonstrated what it means to, perform charity and think of others and care for others. Like, I've seen the ways that they go above and beyond to not only financially support, but lots of other support for their, not only their immediate family, but their community, where they're from. Like both my stepmother and my grandmother send money back home to like Bangladesh and Pakistan to essentially feed dozens of families who don't have the resources. And that is emblematic of this like collective experience and wanting to look out for each other. And I think that that's something that the queer community is also really good at. Is I think it's both, right? Because in the queer community there is a real sense of individualism and defining yourself for yourself, but at the same time there's also this history of chosen family. And I think especially among the queer community, the queer and trans community who aren't white, there's just a natural sense of like solidarity and movement building. Like if you want to see like who's building the movement, find the like queer, trans, black folks in your community. Like they're going to be doing the work, oftentimes. And it's unfair that they're often the ones that we expect to do the work. And I think that's where we need to expand these movements to include more people and more people showing up and doing the work. Yeah, that's where I feel like I've learned a lot about solidarity and community in being a queer Muslim. Um, and I hope that those lessons get shared. I know that they exist in other communities too. And I think that if we continue to only act in our individual interest in this country, I really am deeply concerned for what the future looks like. Because if we can't wake up to a collective interest, how will we fight something as immense as the climate crisis, which is a literal threat to all of our lives, and it will impact the most marginalized and is impacting the most marginalized right now. Shifting to my vision of the future, this is a practice I really am thankful to a young organizer who I've been working with, Sumaya Ali, who turned me on to this idea of collective dreaming, visioning, and believing in imagination. Because I think that's something we're really lacking as a community right now, as a world, is like we need to allow our imagination to meet the enormity and pressure of this moment. If we can't dream big and come up with solutions that are outside of the box, if we can't even, you know, invest in something that feels as obvious as the Green New Deal. So my vision is that we need to allow all of us, um, to lean into our inner artist and like our willingness to imagine a different world and to come up with new solutions and to try them rather than doubt the young folks who are like, if we try this we might save the world, and then be like, oh, that costs too much money. Money is immaterial ultimately, like what is money going to get you if the whole world is on fire? There's like the big idea thinking, and then there's what I want in like the practical day to day. And that's everyone can organize, everyone can invest in their communities, everyone can find a way to give back. If you don't have financial resources, like there are many of us who don't have financial resources. I can't really give to charity in the ways that I want to, but I can invest in my communities. I can like treat other people who I come across in life with compassion and try to be open and vulnerable. Because if we can't create spaces where people like me can feel held and vulnerable and honest and like able to express themselves, I'm losing my train of thought a little bit. But I think like the core of it is we all deserve to be happy and to feel worthy. And we can't do that without supporting each other and investing in our collective interest. And I think there are ways to do that every day, whether it's showing up for the people in your immediate family or in your household or in your apartment building. And then there's like the broader, like we need to be thinking about folks who aren't being uplifted, who are struggling, who don't have a community to rely on. Because ultimately, we are all in community with each other, even when we don't want to be.
I like that. No, I really love that. And I will end off and top it off with, I think it will help a lot for each of us, kind of like to tangibilize what you mentioned about exercising it every day, that if we can all take a moment to understand our identities and understand where we have privilege and where we are oppressed, and then using that knowledge to channel the guilt that we face from having those privilege to activating for those who do not have those privilege.
Mhm.
I think it's really critical because early on this conversation you mentioned about while there's trials and tribulations, there's also celebration, and that called in for me to really understand that I should really transform that guilt of not knowing, transform that guilt of never having the experience what people do not have this heterosexual and cisgender privilege experience, and channel that into activation, right? And continue to putting in the work to understand more and really understanding how I can help. And I think that would be kind of like my message out there, that I hope that audiences who are listening into this and are kind of like, oh my gosh, so what should I do now? Take some time, sit with yourself and figure out how you can channel that reckoning and that awakening into something that would benefit, like you say, a collective well-being. And I think
Yeah.
that would be very important.
I mean, I love what you're saying. And I think this is the conversation I love to have with people because I think you're identifying a really key point. So, one, I do believe that the first battle, the first like fight for justice is internal. Like, if you don't come to terms with who you are, it's hard to see outside of yourself. And you'll spend the rest of your life grappling with yourself without being able to even see what other people are struggling with. So, yeah, first battle is internal. That, I think is true. And I think you can be having that battle and doing some of the latter. I do think that guilt is holding a lot of people back. And I think that for us to actually movement build, like, I want people who maybe don't have marginalized identities. I want straight white men, straight cis white men to realize like it's okay to celebrate who you are. Like no one's identity is inherently harmful. Like everyone should be able to celebrate themselves. I don't think that I'm advocating for a world where the only people who are celebrated are people who are as marginalized or more marginalized than me. Like everyone should be celebrated. And the more we trap ourselves in guilt, for how we have privilege, then we're not actually using our privilege to help others. We're just sitting in stasis. And I think this is actually really, really important for people to realize right now is the moment is too urgent for you to sit in stasis and feel guilty. It doesn't mean that you need to show up like with your body on the line to every protest. Like that's not sustainable for anyone. I do think we need to shift from the listening and talking to action. And it you like I think we also need to create a space where it's okay to make mistakes in that process. Like I loved in our conversation and preparing for this interview that we allowed for each other the space to make mistakes. Like, we can make mistakes. It is human to make mistakes. I think it's so important that folks move past that anxiety and guilt to action and, trust that you will make mistakes and it will be painful and you're going to learn some lessons and maybe people will call you out. And then you move on and grow from that. Isn't that the goal, to grow? Like, otherwise, we sit in stasis, we ruminate, we worry about what we're not doing, we literally tally in our heads all the things that we haven't done. And then does that serve the people you're feeling guilty about? That's something I think about a lot because there are many ways I'm marginalized, there are many ways I'm privileged. I think a lot about, how am I showing up for Black lives? And I can feel really guilty that like we were in the middle of the pandemic. I was so scared and anxious that I didn't really leave my apartment during the whole uprising this summer. And I can sit there in that guilt and I can worry about the ways that I haven't shown up for people in my community. Or I can do the organizing work now and just focus on action. I can invest in our defund campaign. I can, doing counter surveillance work is racial justice work. There are ways to look out for folks, to support folks financially, to support folks emotionally. Actions speak louder than words. And I think that it's a cliche and there's also a lot of weight in it. So yeah, reflection is key. Absolutely take the time to reflect. I think everybody should also be in therapy. I think therapy is an immensely useful tool. I don't think I would be the movement builder the organizer I am without it. And yeah, trying to exercise that guilt and instead create spaces for collective action.
For sure. And practicing the abundance mindset is not a competition. Everyone, like you mentioned with how you activate for Black Lives, everyone has different methods of activating.
Mhm.
So stand proud in that, in whatever ways you activate for others. And yeah, like comparison really robs you from your joy and from your pride. So any last words for the audiences before we go, Jordan?
Know your worth. And I say that to, especially given my identities, to the young queer Muslims out there, like, know your worth. You are worthy of love. You're worthy of finding a job where you feel supported and able to be yourself. You deserve a loving family, whether that is the family by birth or your chosen family. Yeah, know your worth and trust that you are worthy. And it's a hard thing to believe, and it's an everyday struggle. It's taken me a long time to be able to say, like, I am worthy, and I am, in all of my identities and all of the mistakes I've made and all of the triumphs and tribulations and celebrations. Like, I am worthy. I believe you, Xin Yi, are worthy. I believe every person listening in the audience is worthy. And I think if we go about our lives believing in our own worth and the worth of the people who enter our lives and surround us and the people we don't agree with, so much will shift.
Thank you, Jordan. I think that's a great conclusion. And once again, you're listening to What's Going On by Suffolk University Center for Student Diversity and Inclusion. Thank you for listening in, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.